For neurophysiology, we'll be discussing the autonomic nervous system or the ANS. This innervates and regulates the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, and the glands. And we'll tackle first the organization of the ANS. There are two motor neuron systems, the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. So for the pre and the postganglionic neurons, there are sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So for the preganglionic neuron, the sympathetic nervous system originate in the spinal cord segments from T1 to L3 or from thoracolumbar region. And the length of preganglionic nerve axon in sympathetic nervous system is short. And the neurotransmitter in the ganglion is acetylcholine. So as we can see here, in the sympathetic preganglionic neuron, it is short and the neurotransmitter in the ganglion is acetylcholine. Okay, so next is the parasympathetic nervous system in the preganglionic neuron. This can be seen in the brainstem and from the cranial nerves 10, 9, 7, and 3. So 1973. And also, it can be originated in the sacral segment of the spinal cord S2 to S4. So the parasympathetic nervous system originates in cranial nerves 10, 9, 7, 3, and S2 to S4. And the length of the preganglionic nerve axon is long and the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. As indicates here in the picture, in the parasympathetic, it is long in the preganglionic and the neurotransmitter in the ganglion is the acetylcholine. Okay, now let's go to the postganglionic neuron. For the sympathetic nervous system in the postganglionic neuron, the cell body is in the paravertebral or prevertebral ganglia. And the length of the postganglionic nerve axon is long, and the neurotransmitter in effector organs is the norepinephrine, except the sweat glands, which uses acetylcholine. And the next is the postganglionic neuron, the parasympathetic. The cell body is in the ganglia at the wall of effector organ, and the length of postganglionic nerve axon of the parasympathetic is short, and the neurotransmitter in effector organ is acetylcholine. So for the sympathetic receptor types in effector organs, it is adrenergic, the alpha 1, the alpha 2, the B1, and the B2. So adrenergic receptors are the types of receptor in effector organs in the sympathetic nervous system. However, in the parasympathetic, the receptor in effector organ is muscarinic receptor. Now let's discuss the ANS neurotransmitters. We have adrenergic neurons, cholinergic neurons, non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic neurons. So the adrenergic neurons, this releases norepinephrine. This is sympathetic nervous system. And the cholinergic neurons, it releases acetylcholine, which can be seen in the sympha and parasympathetic. And the non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic neurons, this releases substance P and vasointestinal peptide or VIP and nitric oxide or NO. Okay. So what are the ANS receptors? So we have two types, the adrenoreceptors and the cholinereceptors. So for the adrenoreceptors, these are the receptor in the sympathetic, and we have here the alpha 1, alpha 2, B1, and B2. So the mnemonic we have KISS, Q-I-S-S. So in alpha 1, it's GQ protein that is responsible for the IP3 and calcium to increase, and it causes smooth muscle contraction. We can see this action in the uterine contraction, and it is equal to norepi and epi, but norepinephrine has higher sensitivity. And next is the alpha 2. Here, GI protein is responsible for lowering the CAMP, so there's decrease in CAMP, and it inhibits the release of the norepinephrine for presynaptic nerve terminals, and it inhibits sympathetic effects, and it promotes parasympathetic effect, and often produce inhibition, or there will be a relaxation or dilation, and it is located in the postganglionic nerve terminals, so the autoreceptor, in the platelets, in the fat cells, in the GI wall or the heteroreceptor. Another adrenoreceptor is the B1. So here, GS protein is responsible for increasing the AMP, and it is seen in the heart, in the kidneys, which triggers the RAAS, and in the adipose tissues for adults. But if it's neonatal brown adipose tissue, B3 is utilized, and this B1 causes excitation. And another adrenal receptor is the B2. So GS protein is also responsible to increase this AMP, but this one causes smooth muscle relaxation. And it is responsible for the vasodilation of the blood vessel and bronchodilation, which is the sympathetic effect. And it is most sensitive to epinephrine than epinephrine, and more sensitive to epi than the dopamine 1 receptor. So that's B2. That's in contrast with the alpha 1, which causes smooth muscle contraction and more sensitive to norepi. However, in B2, it causes smooth muscle relaxation and more sensitive to epinephrine. So another ANS receptor is the cholinergic receptor. So here we have two types of cholinergic receptor, the nicotinic receptor and the muscarinic receptor. So for the nicotinic receptor, we have NM or N1 and NN or N2. So the NM or N1, it is located at the neuromuscular junction and in adrenal medulla. It can be found in the skeletal muscle in the motor end plate that binds with the acetylcholine, and it opens the sodium-potassium channel. And the N2 or the NN, it is located in the autonomic ganglia. There's dendrites of postganglionic neurons, and it binds with acetylcholine. It opens sodium and potassium channel, and this N2 or NN is blocked by the ganglionic blockers such as the hexametonium. Okay, so that's the nicotinic receptor, the NM and the NN. And for the muscarinic receptor, we have here the mnemonic kick, because we have here muscarinic, the M1, the M2, and the M3. So the M1, it is can be found in CNS, and it binds with acetylcholine using the GQ protein, and it increases the IP3 calcium. And the M2 can be seen in the heart, and it binds with acetylcholine using the GI, and it inhibits or decreases the CAMP. And the next is the M3, can be seen in the glands and smooth muscle, and it binds with acetylcholine using GQ. And as well, like M1, it increases the IP3 and the calcium. So that's the muscarinic receptor, and that's all about the ANS receptors. Now, let's discuss some organs that have sympathetic and parasympathetic action. First, we have the heart. So the sympathetic action of the heart, it increases the heart rate, the contractility, the AV node, and the responsible receptor for this is the B1. And the parasympathetic action of the heart, so it all decreases the heart rate and the contractility of the atria and the AV node conduction are all decreased. And the responsible parasympathetic receptor of this is the M2. And we also have another organ, the vascular smooth muscles. The sympathetic action is to constrict the blood vessel in the skin, and it dilates blood vessel in the skeletal muscle. And the responsible sympathetic receptors are alpha 1 and B2. So to constrict the blood vessel in the skin, alpha 1 is responsible. To dilate the blood vessel in the skeletal muscle, B2 is responsible. These vascular smooth muscles doesn't have function in parasympathetic receptor. And parasympathetic receptor. Okay, so next is the GIT. So the sympathetic effect is there's decrease in motility and the sphincters constrict. So the responsible parasympathetic receptor for the GIT is the alpha 2, the B2, and the alpha 1. So it decreases the motility, the alpha 2 and the B2, and constrict the sphincters, the alpha 1. And another and the parasympathetic action of the GIT is it increases the motility and it relaxes the sphincter, so it's a contrast. And the responsible parareceptor is the M3. And for the bronchioles, the sympathetic effect is to dilate the broncholar smooth muscle, the bronchial smooth muscle, and the responsible receptor for this, the sympathetic receptor, is the B2, so it dilates the bronchial smooth muscle. And to constrict the bronchial smooth muscle, this is the parasympathetic action, and the responsible for this parasympathetic action is the M3. And for the male sex organ, the sympathetic effect is to ejaculate using the sympathetic receptor alpha 1, and the parasympathetic is to erect, and the responsible receptor is muscarinic receptor. And for the bladder, the sympathetic effect, it relaxes the bladder wall and it constricts the sphincter. So for the bladder to relax, B2 receptor, a sympathetic receptor, is utilized, and to constrict the sphincter, alpha 1 sympathetic receptor is used. And to contract the bladder wall and relaxes the sphincter for urination, so this is parasympathetic actions of the bladder. It contracts the bladder wall and it relaxes the sphincter. The responsible parasympathetic receptor is the M3. And next organ is the sweat glands. So for the sympathetic effect, the effect is sympathetic. However, the receptor that is used in sweat glands is muscarinic, which is parasympathetic receptor. So the action is sympathetic, however, the receptor is parasympathetic. So there's increased sweating, and the responsible receptor for that is the muscarinic receptor. And for the eye, the sympathetic effect in the eye is to dilate the pupil or mydriasis and dilate the ciliary muscle for vision. So the responsible for this one is the alpha 1 for the mydriasis and the beta receptor for the dilation of the ciliary muscle. And the parasympathetic effect of the eye is to constrict the pupil or miosis and to contract the ciliary muscle for accommodation. So the responsible parasympathetic receptor for this is muscarinic. So here are the singly innervated areas of the sympathetic only and the parasympathetic only. So for the organs that have sympathetic effect only, it is the sweat glands, like increase in sweating, the adrenal glands that has no parasympathetic effect, and mostly the blood vessel, the pilomotor muscles, the cardiac ventricles, and the pregnant uterus. All of these have only sympathetic effect. The sweat glands, adrenal glands, most blood vessel, the pilomotor muscles, the cardiac ventricles, and the pregnant uterus. And the parasympathetic effect only are the lacrimal muscle or the tear glands and the ciliary muscle for accommodation. So for accommodation, there's only parasympathetic effect and the tear glands only parasympathetic effect. And now let's discuss the autonomic centers and the cerebral cortex. So we have the medulla, the pons, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, and the limbic lobe. So first, the medulla. So the medulla is the vasomotor center. It controls the blood pressure as well as the heart rate. And in medulla, we can also see the respiratory center, or the TRG and the VRG. And the swallowing, coughing, and vomiting centers can be found in the medulla. So there are three. In the medulla, there are vasomotor center, respiratory center, swallowing, and coughing, and vomiting centers. For the pons, here we can see the micturition center, the pneumotaxic, and the apneustic center. And this apneustic center modify the output of the DRG, the respiratory center, and it controls the respiratory rate. So that's the apneustic center that can be found in the pons. So in the pons, again, we can find the micturition center and the pneumotaxic and the apneustic center. And for the hypothalamus, here is the temperature regulation and the thirst and food intake, like the feeding, feeling of flight or fight, can be seen in the hypothalamus. And the thalamus is the relay center for almost all sensation and also for memory recall. So this thalamus is a relay for almost all sensation except for olfaction. Next is the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is responsible for the motor, for the personality, for calculation, judgment, and analysis. And the parietal lobe is for somatosensory cortex, occipital lobe for vision, temporal lobe for hearing, vestibular processing, recognition of faces, optic pathway, the Meyer's loop, and to recall memory is located in the temporal lobe. So that's what we can find in temporal lobe: the hearing, vestibular processing, recognition of faces, optic pathway or Meyer's loop, the recall memory. And for the limbic lobe, it is responsible for the behavior, emotions, and motivations. So for the trivia, we have mnemonics here. The 1972 is the vitamin K dependent clotting factors, and 1973 is the cranial nerve and parasympathetic action, the 1973, and the 1975 are all mixed cranial nerve. It means both motor and sensory cranial nerves, the 1975. So that's all about the neurophysiology and autonomic nervous system.